My older brother Cameron and I had planned a camping trip along the East Coast. As usual, Cameron handled all the planning, choosing the site and making all the arrangements. I just tagged along. He picked a solid spot. The campsite was remote, requiring a bit of a hike to reach, which meant we had the place to ourselves, or so we thought. The site itself was a bit undefined, with several small clearings that could have served as designated spots. We didn't stress about it and just picked one. At first, everything seemed peaceful. But as we settled in, we started noticing small, abandoned objects scattered around, things like a single trekking pole, an old pair of hiking boots. Strange, considering how far out we were. People don't just leave stuff like that behind in places like this. It was odd, but we shrugged it off and went about our evening. As night fell, we lit a fire and relaxed, chatting about nothing in particular. A couple of hours passed when I happened to glance over Cameron's shoulder and froze. There, deep in the trees, flickered a faint orange glow. I pointed it out, and we both stared. It was another campfire, burning way out in the woods. Given how thick the forest was, it didn't make much sense. There didn't seem to be any clearing over there. Maybe someone just preferred solitude. We didn't dwell on it too much and continued talking until exhaustion hit. After putting out our fire, we crawled into our tents for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. My stomach twisted as I realized why. I had downed too many drinks before bed. Grumbling to myself, I unzipped the tent and wandered a short distance away to take care of business. As I finished, my eyes drifted back to the distant flame, still burning in the woods. That's when I noticed it. A dark figure, standing between me and the flickering light. A jolt of fear shot through me. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a tree or a strangely shaped bush. But as my vision adjusted, more figures began to emerge from the shadows. 10, maybe 15. All of them standing motionless, watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I turned and walked back toward the tent, heart hammering. Should I wake Cameron? Was I just imagining things? But before I could make up my mind, I stole one last glance toward the tree line. The figures had moved. They were closer. I scrambled back to the tent and shook Cameron awake. His groggy confusion turned to alarm as he followed me outside and saw exactly what I saw. His face drained of color. We didn't wait. Without grabbing anything but our car keys and wallets, we bolted. As we ran, neither of us looked back, too terrified of what we might see. The figures never followed. Later, we reported the incident to the police, but they barely took us seriously. A whole group of people lurking in the woods in the dead of night? Yeah, right. They brushed us off. But we couldn't shake the memory of those abandoned objects at the campsite. Had others encountered the same thing? And if they had, why hadn't they reported it? Or worse, what if they never made it back? 2 years ago, in the middle of spring, I took time off work for a solo camping trip. There was a small lake in northern Minnesota that I had visited before with friends and family, but this time, I wanted to go alone. The hike to the campsite took about 2 hours, nothing too difficult, mostly flat terrain. I set up my tent a little ways into the trees so I wouldn't be right on the water's edge, then settled into my chair with a cold beer, soaking in the peaceful sounds of the lake and the birds. The sun dipped below the horizon faster than I expected, and soon, darkness settled over the forest. Normally, I found nights in the wilderness comforting. There's something liberating about being completely alone in nature. But that night felt different. A strange unease crept over me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the dark tree line. I wasn't the paranoid type, but something about that night put me on edge. Still, every time I looked, I saw nothing. Maybe I was just overthinking. I focused on the fire, trying to relax. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to let my guard down, crack. A sharp, unmistakable snap of a branch breaking under heavy weight. The sound came from directly in front of me, deep in the trees where my firelight couldn't reach. My entire body tensed. It had been loud, too loud to be a squirrel or a raccoon. I swallowed hard. Was it a large animal? A deer, maybe? Or was it something else? Slowly, I reached for my bear spray and called out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Silence. Not even the sound of rustling leaves or shifting undergrowth. The forest had gone completely still. I stayed frozen, staring into the black void beyond my fire. Eventually, I remembered the flashlight in my pack. I dug it out, flicked it on, and aimed it toward the trees. Nothing. The underbrush was undisturbed. No movement. No sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. Still, the paranoia didn't fade. I tossed more wood onto the fire, making sure it burned bright. Every few minutes, I flicked my flashlight back on, sweeping the trees. Then, on one of those sweeps, I saw him. At the farthest edge of the light, half hidden in the darkness, stood a man. Tall. Freakishly tall. The second the light hit him, he stepped back, vanishing into the black. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. How long had he been standing there? How long had he been watching me? The branch snap. It had to have been him. Panic surged through me. I moved fast, breaking down my tent and shoving my belongings into my backpack. I wasn't staying to find out what he wanted. I took off in the opposite direction of where I'd last seen him, back toward my car. At first I ran. But after a while, when I felt like I had put enough distance between us, I slowed to a quick walk, keeping my flashlight on its dimmest setting. As I walked, questions churned in my head. Why hadn't he approached me? Why just stand there? Watch me? Then it hit me. Maybe he was waiting. Maybe he had been trying to see if I had a weapon. Or maybe he had been waiting for me to fall asleep. I made it back to my car without seeing him again. But ever since that night, every time I go camping, I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is watching. And this time, I might not see them before they see me. Back in 2014, I took a 4-day weekend off work and decided to go camping. The area I lived in had plenty of small campgrounds tucked away in the woods, and I found a quiet, isolated one about 45 minutes from town. It was a simple setup, just a small dirt parking lot with 3 designated sites nearby. No one else was there when I arrived, so I picked the far left spot and got to work setting up my tent. The short walk from my truck to the site was only about 5 minutes, but the thick trees made it feel much deeper into the forest. For the first hour, I just sat around, taking in the silence. Then boredom hit. I figured there might be a hiking trail somewhere nearby, so I wandered back toward the entrance to check. That's when I saw it. Another car had pulled up beside mine, an old, beat-up red Toyota. Rust covered the body, dents and scratches everywhere. But the thing that stood out the most? No license plates. Front or back. A weird feeling crawled up my spine, but I brushed it off. Someone else must have come to camp at one of the other sites. No big deal. I turned back toward my campsite, sat on a log, and tried to relax. 10 minutes later, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man walking down the narrow path toward my site. No backpack. No gear. Just him. His clothes were ragged, holes and stains covering his brown jacket. His beard and hair looked greasy and unkempt. Despite his disheveled appearance, he was staring straight at me, like he had come here for a reason. "You wouldn't happen to be able to help me with something real quick, would you?" he asked. I hesitated. But not wanting to be rude, I shrugged. Sure. What do you need?" He smiled, but it felt off. "Not just yet," he said. "I'll come back for you when I'm ready." With that, he turned and walked back toward the parking lot. I sat there confused. What was that about? If he needed help, Why come all the way to my campsite just to tell me he'd be back later? I figured he was unpacking his car first or something, so I waited. 15 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. Nothing. By the time the sun set, I had forgotten about him entirely. I had my fire going, was making dinner, and was starting to feel more at ease. Then footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the darkness behind me. I turned, but at first I saw nothing. The woods were too dark. But I could hear him, his boots crunching against the gravel path. Then, like something stepping out of a nightmare, he emerged into the glow of my campfire. That same man? He stopped just at the edge of the light, his face unreadable. "You ready?" he asked. I blinked. "For what?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gave another strange smile, like he was trying to put me at ease. But the longer I looked at him, the more I realized how unnatural it felt, too forced, too eager. "It'll only take a minute," he finally said. "You're not busy, right?" The way he said it, like he was trying to make it sound casual. But his body language told a different story. He was too still. Too expectant. Something was wrong. Against my better judgment, I hesitantly stood up. My brain screamed at me to say no, to refuse, but my awkwardness got the better of me. Before I knew it, I was following him into the darkness. We walked deeper into the woods. With every step, the firelight behind me faded, and the shadows swallowed us whole. That's when I realized he wasn't carrying a flashlight. Nothing. Just walking confidently into the pitch black, like he knew exactly where he was going. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. "So, what did you need help with?" I asked, my voice unsteady. For a second he slowed, like he was about to answer. Then, he just kept walking. No reply. That was it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop. I slowed my pace, putting a little distance between us. Then he turned. The firelight barely touched his face now, but I could see his smile had vanished. He was frowning. He knew. His hand moved toward his jacket, and in that split second, I saw the handle of something sticking out from inside. I ran. I didn't think, I just turned and sprinted into the trees. I could hear him behind me, his heavy footsteps crashing against the forest floor. He was chasing me. I ran blindly, branches slapping against my arms, my legs burning. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of his footsteps faded. I kept running until I reached my truck, my lungs on fire. My hands fumbled to unlock the door, but I managed to throw myself inside and start the engine. When the police arrived, the red Toyota was gone. So was the man. I gave them every detail I could, his appearance, his car, even the missing plates. But there wasn't enough information to track him down. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if I had kept following him into the dark. But I do know one thing, he didn't need help. He was hunting. My brother Jason and I had always dreamed of living near the mountains, so when we moved to Colorado, a few years back, we decided to split the rent on a townhouse just outside Denver. The location was perfect, only a short drive from endless hiking and camping trails. The only downside? These trails were always packed with people. Locals, tourists, and outdoor enthusiasts crowded them year-round, making it nearly impossible to find real solitude. That's why Jason and I planned a 3-day backpacking trip, venturing deeper into the wilderness, hoping for some peace and quiet. Jason mapped out the route, and when the day finally came, we packed up and drove to the trailhead. There was only one other car in the parking area, a dusty, old SUV that looked like it had been through rough terrain. The thought of another hiker out there didn't bother us. In fact, we welcomed the idea of having the trail mostly to ourselves. The first day was challenging but rewarding. We hiked about 8 miles, most of it on relatively flat terrain, until the final stretch, where we ascended a rugged mountainside. It was exhausting, but Jason assured me the campsite would be worth it. He wasn't wrong. 3/4 up the mountain, we found a small, flat clearing along the edge of a cliff, offering a breathtaking view of the valley below. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the scene was almost surreal. After setting up camp, we gathered some sticks and stones to build a fire pit. We spent hours sitting by the flames, chatting and enjoying the crisp mountain air. Then we heard it, footsteps crunching along the trail. We immediately fell silent, listening as the footsteps drew closer. Within moments, a man emerged from the darkness, stepping into the flickering firelight. Something about him felt off. He wasn't wearing a headlamp, a must-have for any serious hiker traveling at night. His clothes were disheveled, and yet he had this unsettling grin plastered on his face. Jason was the first to speak. "Hey, do you need something?" he asked, standing up. The man glanced at Jason, then at me, his grin never faltering. "I'm a park ranger," he said. "You two aren't supposed to be here. This section is closed for the season." That didn't make sense. We knew the park was open. In fact, we had obtained camping permits from the state just the day before. Besides, no ranger would be patrolling a remote mountain trail this late at night. Something was wrong. Jason and I exchanged a look, silently confirming we were on the same page. We started asking questions, but the man cut us off abruptly. "You need to leave. Now. Pack up your things and follow me. I'll take you back to the trailhead." His tone was firm, but his expression never changed. That eerie grin remained. Jason stood his ground. "No," he said flatly. "We're staying." For a moment, the man just stared at us. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. We didn't speak for several minutes after that. We just sat there, listening, waiting to see if he would return. The fire crackled softly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Every now and then, we thought we heard distant footsteps, but we never saw him again. Neither of us slept that night. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and retraced our steps, cutting our trip short. When we reached the parking lot, that same dusty SUV was still sitting there. A disturbing thought crossed our minds. Had the other hiker run into the same man? And if so, what had happened to them? We reported the encounter to the police, but nothing ever came of it. The man had clearly lied about being a ranger, and the fact that he tried to lead us away in the middle of the night suggested something far more sinister. What he had planned for us, we'll never know. But someone else might have found out the hard way. Back in college, my friends and I were avid campers, always finding time for weekend trips into the wilderness. But after graduation, our schedules never aligned. Eventually, I started going solo. One weekend, I decided to revisit an old camping ground we used to frequent. It was remote, a bit difficult to get to, but that's exactly why I liked it. Most people opted for easier spots, meaning I could have the place to myself. The hike-in was familiar, and I reached the site without a hitch. I set up my tent, got everything organized, and started settling in. That's when I noticed someone else arriving. It was a man, dressed like any other hiker, but something felt off. He carried only a small backpack, no tent, no camping gear, nothing that suggested he planned to stay the night. And yet, he didn't seem to be passing through. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he just wanted some solitude like I did. He lingered on the other side of the campground, and we didn't interact. As the afternoon wore on, I eventually saw him leave. It struck me as odd. He was heading out late, with barely an hour of daylight left, and the hike back was a solid 3 hours. But I didn't dwell on it. With the area to myself again, I started preparing dinner. I'd boiled some water on my small stove, made a freeze-dried meal, and sat near my tent, enjoying the stillness. As the last light faded from the sky, I hung a lantern on my tent and sat outside for a while, just soaking in the atmosphere. That's when the feeling hit me. I was alone. Completely alone. No laughter, no campfire conversations, just silence. After a while, I turned off my lantern and crawled into my tent, zipping it shut and settling in for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The air was still, the night quiet, and then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching against the dirt and dry leaves just beyond my tent. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Swallowing hard, I reached for my lantern, fumbling to turn it on. The moment the light flickered to life, I unzipped the tent and peeked out. And there he was. The man from earlier. He stood about 20 feet away, in the exact spot I had last seen him before he left. He wasn't moving. Just standing there. Watching. I called out. "Hey, you okay?" No response. He didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge me at all. I couldn't tell which direction he was facing, but he was either staring at me or looking just beyond me. And somehow, both possibilities felt equally disturbing. My hand found the pocket knife in my bag, gripping it tightly as I sat there, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Confront him? Stay silent? Pretend to sleep? Minutes passed, agonizingly slow. The man barely moved. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. As he moved, I could finally see the angle of his body. He had been staring at me the entire time. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake, knife in hand, waiting to hear if he would return. He never did. At first light, I packed up and left, hiking out as fast as I could. I made it back safely, but that trip changed something for me. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know what that man wanted, but the idea of waking up that night and seeing him still standing there, staring at me or worse, never waking up at all, I can't shake it. I had been camping alone, in the backcountry near my hometown, something I did often. I wasn't an experienced hiker, so I never ventured too far, maybe a mile or two from the trailhead at most. This particular trip had been peaceful. My campsite was set up by a lake, and I planned to stay for a few more nights. On the third day, I decided to hike back to my truck, grab some extra food and my fishing rod, and head back to camp. When I returned, something was different. Another tent had appeared near the lake. I hadn't seen anyone on the only trail leading in, but I figured maybe there was another way in that I didn't know about. Either way, I didn't think much of it. I set up my fishing rod and spent the next few hours casting lines into the lake. Every so often, I glanced over at the new tent, but I never saw anyone near it. It was just sitting there, untouched. As the sun dipped lower, I packed up my gear and returned to my own campsite. I ate dinner, gathered firewood, and waited until dark to light my fire. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Just beyond the fire's glow, I caught the briefest glimpse of movement. A figure in the trees. I told myself it was the other camper, probably gathering wood. But something felt off. Why were they so close to my sight? And why did they disappear the moment I noticed them? I tried to shake the feeling and focused on the fire. The warmth, the light, the sound of crackling wood. It was comforting. Then movement again. Not just one figure, four. They emerged from the tree line, walking directly toward me. I tensed, my mind racing. Maybe they were a group of hikers passing through? Maybe they needed help? But as they stepped into the firelight, I saw their faces. Expressionless. Cold. They didn't speak. They just kept walking, straight for me. My instincts screamed at me to move, to do something. But before I could react, two of them veered behind me, heading straight for my tent. The other two stepped closer, forcing me backward. I tried to ask them what they wanted, but they ignored me. Then, without warning, The two men by my tent started rummaging through my things. Panic surged through me. The other two continued pushing me, further from the fire, deeper into the darkness. My breathing quickened. My mind raced. They weren't just here to rob me. They were leading me away. I had no time to think. The second one of them reached into his pocket, I bolted. I didn't look back. I just ran. Branches whipped against my arms as I sprinted through the dark, my feet barely finding the trail. I ran straight to my truck, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. I waited. Nothing. The forest remained eerily silent. The next morning, I reported it to the police. They found no sign of the men, no trace of my stolen gear, nothing. But I knew exactly what they had planned for me. And I knew just how close I had come to never making it out of that forest. Back in 2016, I lived in a small, tight-knit town surrounded by dense forests. There wasn't much to do besides hiking and camping, unless you wanted to drive an hour to the next larger town. My friend Matt and I often went camping, and this time, he suggested a spot recommended by another friend. It was only a short 15-minute drive from the town's outskirts, but there was no official parking, just a narrow trail leading into the woods. After walking for about an hour, we reached the supposed campsite. Matt's friend had mentioned a great lake view, but what we found was more of a murky swamp, overgrown and uninviting. Laughing it off, we noticed a lone tent on the opposite side of the water. As my eyes scanned further along the shoreline, I spotted a figure standing there, watching us. Trying to keep things from feeling awkward, I gave a small wave. The person didn't respond but remained eerily still. We assumed they were the owner of the tent, and went about setting up our own camp on a hill away from the water. Throughout the day, we occasionally glanced toward the tent, but the person was never near it. Either they were wandering deeper into the trees, or they had left entirely. As the sun set and we built our fire, we eventually stopped thinking about it, until something happened. Matt suddenly leaped up from his chair, his eyes locked on something behind me. I turned and saw the outline of a figure standing just 20 feet away. Their long, unkempt black hair blended with the darkness, and their clothes were equally shadowy, making it hard to tell if they were a man or a woman, or if they were holding anything. Matt called out, "Hey! Are you alright?" I followed up with a nervous, "Do you need something?" The person lingered for a moment, then abruptly turned and hurried off into the night. Matt and I exchanged an uneasy glance, trying to shake off the unsettling encounter. We reasoned that it must have been the same person from across the pond, but there was no real explanation for why they had been watching us from so close. Somehow, we managed to go to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke to Matt urgently unzipping my tent and shaking me awake. His breathing was ragged, and his face was filled with fear. "Someone was standing right outside your tent," he whispered, his voice barely holding steady. "I saw them through my tent opening, and when they noticed me, they ran." A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to stay calm. Our options weren't great, either risk hiking the dark, narrow path back or stay put and hope nothing worse happened. We decided to rebuild our fire and stay up until sunrise, keeping our bags packed in case we had to make a run for it. At the first light of dawn, we wasted no time leaving. Later that day, we reported the incident to the police, thinking it might help warn other campers. To our surprise, they called us back for further questioning. It turned out the tent we had seen belonged to a person who had been missing for over a month. The authorities searched the area but found nothing else. When they showed us photos of the missing person, both Matt and I knew for certain it wasn't the same person we saw watching us. That realization sent a wave of dread through me. Whoever had been out there wasn't just another camper. They may have had something to do with the missing person's fate. And if Matt hadn't woken up that night, I might have disappeared too. I was camping out in the woods behind my property, something I did often since I had a decent stretch of forested land. I had a small clearing about a 10 to 15-minute walk from my house that I like to use for these solo trips. It wasn't anything special, no breathtaking views or lakes, just a quiet place to unwind. On this particular evening, sometime in mid-fall, I headed down around 4 p.m. to set up camp. As I was unpacking, I happened to notice someone walking in the distance, maybe 100 yards away. Given that this was my land, seeing a stranger out there was unusual. It wasn't a public trail, and the only way to get there was by trespassing from a neighbor's property. The person was moving away from my house, heading toward the neighboring woods, so I decided not to think too much of it. The next few hours were peaceful. I sat back in my chair, enjoying the quiet sounds of the forest. As the sun dipped below the trees and darkness settled in, I'd built up my fire, stacking logs and sticks onto the flames. It was about an hour into the night when I suddenly heard something that made my skin crawl. Footsteps. But not just any footsteps. Someone was running. A full-on sprint through the trees. I turned in the direction of the sound, my eyes scanning the pitch-black woods. The heavy footfalls rushed past my campsite, moving deeper into the forest before fading into the distance. Who the hell runs through the woods in the dead of night? The eerie thought gnawed at me, but after a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself that whoever it was had no interest in me. Maybe it was some reckless hiker or a lost hunter. Still, my instincts told me to stay on high alert. I kept my fire going for another 2 hours, determined to shake the unease. Nothing else happened, and eventually, I decided to turn in for the night. I let the fire die down, climbed into my tent, and drifted off to sleep. That didn't last long. I woke up to the unmistakable sound of rapid footsteps, this time, heading straight for my tent. My heart pounded as I sat up, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped abruptly, just outside the thin fabric walls. A shadow loomed on the other side, shifting slightly, as if whoever was out there was peering inside. Then, a sharp sound, a blade slicing through the fabric. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to see a knife slowly carving a slit into my tent. And through that opening, a pair of eyes locked onto mine. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I lunged forward, bursting out of the tent and sprinting into the woods. I shouted as loudly as I could, hoping to startle them, to make them hesitate just long enough for me to escape. Adrenaline pushed me forward, and I didn't stop until I was back at my house. Gasping for breath, I turned toward the tree line, and saw them. A figure stood just beyond the trees, watching me. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police, keeping my eyes locked on the shadowy form in the woods. But by the time officers arrived, the person was gone. The next morning, authorities searched my campsite, but there were no leads. No footprints they could track, no abandoned gear, nothing. It was as if whoever had been out there simply vanished. The thought that terrified me the most wasn't just that they had a knife, or that they had been running around in the dark. It was the fact that they had followed me home. They knew where I lived. For the next month, I barely slept, jumping at every little noise outside my window. Nothing else has happened since, but I still live with the unease of not knowing who they were, or if they ever planned to come back. This happened 3 years ago, just as December was beginning. Where I live, winter doesn't fully set in until late December, and snow usually doesn't come until January. I loved camping and always tried to fit in as many trips as possible before the cold made it impossible. For my last trip of the season, I took a few days off work and drove about an hour north to a trail I had camped at before. I knew it would be a little colder up there, but I had the right gear to handle it. I arrived at the trailhead a little after sunrise. There were only 2 other cars parked there. One was a normal-looking minivan, and the other was a mud-covered truck that looked like it had been off-roading. I figured I might run into some other campers along the way. As I hiked in, I passed an older man and a kid heading back toward the lot. They looked like they had camped the night before, which likely explained the minivan. That meant, as far as I could tell, there should have been just one other person or group out there. But when I got to the campsite, it was completely empty. It was a quiet little clearing near a slow-moving pond, and I set my tent up near the trees. For a while, I sat and wrote in my journal, but as the day went on, the temperature dropped. I decided to get a fire going for warmth. Not long after I lit the fire, another person appeared on the trail. He was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a heavy coat with a cloth covering the lower half of his face. He had a small backpack slung over his shoulder. As he walked past me, I noticed something odd. His backpack looked completely empty. The fabric wasn't stretched or bulging in any way, like there was barely anything inside. He didn't speak, just kept walking until he reached the opposite side of the clearing. Then he sat down against a tree, facing the pond. At first, I thought he might be waiting for a friend, but as time passed, 45 minutes, maybe more, no one else showed up. Even stranger, the man didn't move. He just sat there, staring out at the water. A creeping unease settled in. There was something off about him. Then, without warning, he stood up and started walking toward me. He stopped at the edge of my fire and smiled. But his eyes didn't match the smile. They were heavy, tired, and empty, making his grin seem unnervingly forced. "Hope you don't mind if I share your fire," he said, his voice casual. "It's colder than I expected." I nodded, trying to keep my tone friendly. "Yeah, no problem." But my instincts were screaming at me. I glanced at his backpack again. No tent, no real supplies. Nothing about him suggested he had come prepared for a night in the woods. "Did you bring a tent?" I asked. "It's supposed to get even colder tonight." He shook his head. "Nope." He didn't elaborate. For the next 10 minutes, we sat in silence. I tried to focus on the fire, but I could feel his eyes on me. A decision formed in my mind. I wasn't staying here. I forced myself to act natural as I stood up and casually walked over to my tent, grabbing my sleeping bag to start rolling it up. I didn't want to make it obvious that I was leaving, but I could feel him watching my every move. Then, without a word, he got up. He turned and walked back toward the tree where he had been sitting earlier, but he didn't stop. He continued into the woods, disappearing from sight. I held my breath, listening. The forest was silent. I didn't waste any time. I packed up as quickly as I could, leaving the fire burning in case he was watching me from the darkness. If he thought I was still there, maybe he wouldn't follow. The next 2 hours of hiking back were some of the most unnerving of my life. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind had me on edge. I kept expecting to hear footsteps rushing up behind me. But I made it back to my car. As I passed the trailhead, I noticed the muddy truck was gone. If that had been his, fine. But if not, then how did he get there? And worse, what had he been planning to do if I had stayed? I don't know what would have happened that night, but the thought of it still lingers in the back of my mind. My girlfriend and I were avid campers, often heading into the Appalachian Mountains for weekend getaways. Living in Virginia, we had easy access to countless trails, and spending time outdoors was our escape from stressful work weeks. One Saturday, we chose a 3-mile trail leading to a secluded campsite on a flatter section of the mountain. We'd never been to this particular spot, but its positive reviews reassured us. The drive was short, just 45 minutes, but as we got closer, rain started pouring. Mountain weather could be unpredictable, but we were used to it and didn't let it deter us. When we reached the trailhead, there was only one other car parked nearby. Oddly, the passenger door was slightly open. No one was around, so I walked over and pushed it shut, figuring the owner had left it open by mistake. With that, we grabbed our gear and began the hike. The trek took about 2 hours since most of it was uphill. When we arrived at the campsite, we immediately noticed a small tent already pitched in the middle of the clearing. It was tiny, definitely meant for just one person. We assumed whoever was inside was staying dry from the rain, So we moved to a far corner and set up our own tent. After an hour of resting and drying off, we heard voices outside. The sound of rain against the tent made it impossible to hear clearly, so I unzipped the flap and peeked out. I was startled as two men were crouched just a few feet away, staring at us. They quickly smiled and introduced themselves, claiming they had been camping there for a few days. Something about them felt off. Their clothes, tight jeans and basic t-shirts, didn't seem suited for the rugged conditions. And their tent? There was no way it could fit two grown men comfortably. They left after a brief chat, and I zipped the tent shut. My girlfriend and I exchanged uneasy glances. We decided to keep a small gap in the zipper so we could watch them, just in case. An hour passed, then another. We saw no movement from their tent. It was unsettling, but eventually, night fell, and we decided to sleep. Sometime after midnight, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. Slipping on a cheap rain poncho, I stepped out behind the tent. That's when I heard voices. I turned in every direction, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. The rain distorted the sound, but my gut told me something wasn't right. Then, I noticed something chilling. The small tent in the center of the site was unzipped. It looked empty. My stomach dropped. The men had said they were staying the night, so where were they? I rushed back to wake my girlfriend. As I whispered my concern, we both heard it. Low voices behind our tent. My heart pounded. I grabbed my pocket knife and stepped outside. There, just feet away, stood the two men. They stared at me, completely motionless, their expressions blank and unreadable. A wave of terror washed over me. These men weren't just fellow campers. They were up to something. Something bad. My girlfriend peeked outside, and that snapped me into action. I shouted for her to run, pointing toward the trail. She bolted, and I followed, leaving everything behind. We sprinted for 10 solid minutes before slowing to a quick walk. When we finally reached the parking lot, the other car was still there, and the passenger door was open again. We drove straight to the nearest gas station and called the police. Days later, we learned that the car belonged to an older man who had recently been reported missing. The tent and gear at the campsite were his. But the two men? Nowhere to be found. Neither was the old man. To this day, I don't know what those men intended to do, but I do know that whatever it was, we barely escaped it. My job had me traveling constantly in my late 20s and early 30s. Most trips were brief, leaving little time for leisure. But after finishing work early on an assignment in Pennsylvania, I had an extra day to kill before my flight. Wanting to make the most of it, I found a scenic 6-hour hiking trail online, 3 hours in, 3 hours out. The dense forest and crisp air sounded like the perfect break from my usual routine. After grabbing some hiking gear from a nearby store, I set off around noon. The trail was completely empty, which I welcomed. About an hour in, I spotted a man sitting off to the side. His head hung low, a hood covering his face. As I passed, he suddenly lifted his head, locking eyes with me. A chill ran down my spine. Something about his stare was unsettling. I quickened my pace, occasionally checking behind me to make sure he wasn't following. 2 hours later, I stopped to rest on a fallen log. I had barely taken a few bites of my snack when I saw movement. The same man was now heading toward me. Alarmed, I stuffed my food back into my bag and continued down the trail. I hadn't seen him for hours. How had he caught up so fast? Then I heard it, running footsteps. I turned, and there he was, jogging toward me. I moved aside, hoping he'd just pass, but he stopped directly in front of me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wallet. "I think you dropped this," he said. I glanced at it. It wasn't mine. The wallet was worn, empty, completely unfamiliar. I told him as much, but his expression hardened. "No," he insisted. "This is yours. Take it." His tone made my skin crawl. He wasn't offering, he was demanding. I hesitated. His eyes were locked onto me, filled with something I couldn't quite place. Feeling cornered, I reluctantly took the wallet. His lips curled into a strange smile. "You're welcome." Then, he turned and walked away. I stood there, confused, unsettled. I flipped open the wallet. Nothing inside. Why was he so insistent that I take it? Shaking off the unease, I turned back toward my car. 2 hours later, as I neared the parking lot, the setting sun cast long shadows over the pavement. That's when I saw it. Behind my car, a crouched figure. My breath caught. It was him. I quietly reached for my keys, avoiding any sudden movements. Instead of heading for the driver's side, I walked to the passenger door, unlocking it as smoothly as possible. The moment I got in, he sprang up, lunging for the driver's door. I locked it just in time. His face twisted in fury as he pounded on the window. "Give it back!" he screamed. I ignored him, threw the car into reverse, and sped onto the road. In my rearview mirror, I saw him dart back into the woods. I drove straight to the police station and handed over the wallet. They took my report but had no explanation for what he was trying to do. I never found out his true intentions. And honestly, I don't want to. Late October is my favorite time to hike. The air is crisp, the leaves are vibrant, and the weather is just cool enough to be comfortable. That year, I had a rare weekend off, so I planned a solo overnight hike on a loop trail I had done a couple of years prior. This particular trail wasn't very popular, which I liked. It was about a day and a half long, looping back to the starting point. Early Saturday morning, I packed my gear and drove to the small gravel parking lot at the trailhead. The first few miles were mostly open fields, but eventually, the trail led into dense forest at the base of a small mountain. Around midday, I saw someone approaching in the distance. As he got closer, something about him felt off. He wasn't carrying a backpack, not even a water bottle. That alone was strange, considering how deep into the hike we were. When we passed each other, he gave me a quick wave. I nodded back, but I stayed cautious. Then I heard it. His footsteps stopped. I turned around, and he was facing me. "Where's your group?" he asked. A cold wave of unease hit me. It wasn't what he asked, it was how he asked it. As if he expected me to have people with me. As if he was checking. I forced a smile. "Oh, they're right behind me. Should be here any minute." His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Good." Then, he turned and walked away. I continued forward, but my mind was racing. Why was he so deep into the trail without supplies? And why did he care if I was alone? By late afternoon, I decided to set up camp off-trail. I didn't want to be easily seen. I found a flat, quiet spot about half a mile away, pitched my tent, and tried to shake off the encounter. I ate dinner, watched the sun dip below the trees, and crawled into my tent for the night. Hours passed. I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Close. I held my breath. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I waited, straining to hear. Nothing. No retreating steps, no rustling, just silence. Whoever it was, they were standing there. Watching. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like an eternity. The fear was suffocating. I kept telling myself it was an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Hours crawled by. The first hints of daylight finally crept through the tent fabric. I unzipped the tent just a sliver and peeked outside. Nothing. Slowly, I stepped out, scanning the area. The forest was eerily still. Then I saw them. Footprints. Deep in the dirt, right behind my tent, leading up to a nearby tree. Someone had been standing there. Watching me. For hours. Panic surged through me. I barely took time to pack. I just grabbed my things and bolted for the main trail. My heart pounded as I power walked back the way I came. The entire return trip, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him. But the forest remained eerily empty. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I told my friends what happened, and they all agreed I was lucky. I reported the incident to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. No one else had reported anything unusual. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But I do know this: I will never go on a solo hike again. Back in 2020, when the world was shutting down due to the pandemic, people were stuck indoors, adapting to an unfamiliar way of life. But as an avid backpacker and camper, I saw this as an opportunity to get away. Traveling to different national parks and setting up camp in isolated areas gave me the freedom I desperately needed. One such trip led me to a creek deep within Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. For personal reasons, I won't go into too much detail, but let's just say that something happened at my job in 2019 that seriously damaged my reputation. A mistake on my part led to significant financial losses for others, and as a result, I found myself despised by many. I changed apartments, got a new phone number, and even left my job in an attempt to distance myself from the constant harassment and threats. For a while, I was bombarded with anonymous messages, some simply insulting, others outright menacing. Eventually, the messages stopped, and I thought I had finally been left alone. By the time I arrived at the park, the solitude was striking. Due to both the winter season and the strict lockdown, there was no one else around. The sound of my boots crunching through the thin layer of snow was the only noise accompanying me as I hiked to my destination. After reaching the creek, I found an ideal spot to set up camp, pitching my tent in a clearing slightly off the main trail. As evening fell, I prepared a small meal over my stove, read a few chapters of my book, and finally decided to unwind. I rolled a joint and took a few hits, letting the stress of the past year melt away. That's when my phone vibrated. A new message from an unknown number. "How's the camping trip going, buddy?" A second message followed almost instantly. "It's beautiful out here." Then a third. "I see why you came up here." My heart skipped a beat. My first instinct was to assume it was a family member checking in, but the wording was off. It felt more like someone was watching me. Fighting off the creeping unease, I typed back a quick reply. "Who is this?" The wind whistled through the trees as I waited for a response. My high was quickly transforming into paranoia, and I found myself scanning my surroundings, peering into the darkness beyond the reach of my fire's glow. My fingers tightened around the handle of my P365 handgun, which I had brought along for safety. Minutes passed with no reply. I tried to focus on my book again, but my eyes kept drifting back to my phone. My gut was telling me something wasn't right. Then, another message. "Doesn't matter anymore." A chill ran down my spine. My hands felt clammy as I typed my next question. "How do you know I'm camping?" No response. Instead, the forest remained eerily silent, apart from the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it. Footsteps in the snow. They were slow, deliberate, crunching closer to my tent. My breath hitched as I held onto my gun, ready to disengage the safety if necessary. Suddenly, a flash of light illuminated the fabric of my tent. It was brief, like someone had either taken a picture or shown a flashlight for just a second. My phone vibrated almost immediately after. A new message. The attached image was of my tent, captured from just a few feet away. Then, the final message. "Have a good night's sleep." A surge of adrenaline wiped away any remaining haze from the weed. Without thinking, I unzipped my tent and fired 2 warning shots into the air. The sudden rustling of footsteps in the distance confirmed that someone had been watching me, lurking nearby. I shouted a warning into the darkness before retreating back into my tent, guns still gripped tightly in my hands. That night I barely slept. Every little sound kept me on edge, but no more messages came. By morning, sunlight brought a sense of relief, but the fear still lingered. Whoever had been tormenting me never returned, and the threatening messages ceased entirely after that night. Almost 5 years later, I haven't had another encounter like that. But I always wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't been armed? Two years ago, my dad and I went on a camping trip deep in the country, a place surrounded by nature and steeped in Native American history. The first night was perfect: campfires, laughter, the usual peaceful atmosphere. But by the second night, we were the only ones left in the entire campground. The staff confirmed it. At first, we thought it was great: no noisy campers, just the wilderness and us. As night fell, though, something shifted. The air felt heavier, the woods eerily silent. While walking back from the park's information center, my dad turned to me and said, "Doesn't this feel off? Like a dream?" I felt it too. The forest seemed endless. A growing unease gnawed at us. Trying to shake it off, we started a fire, listened to music, and even smoked a bit to relax. But then, bang! A deep, heavy thud, like a tree falling. It came from the river, about 100 yards away. We grabbed flashlights, but saw nothing. Minutes later, bang! Louder. Closer. Our nervous laughter faded as we realized whatever was making that sound was moving toward us. Another bang, this time terrifyingly close. Fear gripped us. My dad whispered, "We need to get in the tent. Now." We doused the fire and scrambled inside, hearts racing. The final bang was so close it felt like the ground itself shuddered beneath us. My dad froze at the entrance of the tent, staring into the dark. "It's standing there," he muttered. "What's standing there?" I whispered. "I don't know, it's like a wall of darkness." Then came the noise. A deep, vibrating hum, not just a sound, but a feeling, reverberating through our bodies, making our chests tighten. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced. And then, a guttural, unearthly screech. We lay frozen, paralyzed by terror. My dad clutched the only weapon we had, a small knife, useless against whatever was out there. The last thing I remember was blacking out. We woke up suddenly, disoriented. Our phones, previously fully charged, were now dead. The fire we had just stoked was reduced to cold ash, as if untouched. The food we had left out, completely undisturbed. It was still pitch black outside. Neither of us spoke. We just knew something had happened. Something we couldn't explain. As soon as daylight broke, we packed up and left, refusing to talk about it until we were far away. To this day, we don't know what it was. But whatever my dad saw, it wasn't human. And we've never gone camping since. During my childhood, every October, my family had a tradition of spending a weekend in northern Michigan at my Uncle Jim's property. The land spanned 4 acres, a mix of open space and dense woods. His house was big enough to accommodate all of us, making it a perfect annual getaway. One year, my brother Adam, my cousins Jake and Joe, and I decided we wanted to camp outside. Our dads had been drinking and were more easily convinced than usual, while our moms weren't exactly thrilled with the idea. But since our dads approved, they let us go. With their help, we set up a large tent in a clearing just beyond the property line. It was a familiar spot where my uncle had camped before, surrounded by thick trees. After setting up camp, we returned to the house for dinner, where our moms voiced their concerns again. Our dads joked that if anything happened, they'd hear our screams. Later that night, they led us back into the woods, leaving us on our own with flashlights and extra blankets. We weren't as close to the house as we had originally thought. The darkness felt deeper than expected. To pass the time, we played Uno, laughing and having fun, until we heard a scream. It was distant, but unmistakably human. I reassured everyone that foxes could make noises that sound like a woman's scream, trying to ease the tension. But not long after, another scream cut through the night, closer this time. This one sounded undeniably human. Panic set in, and we quickly turned off our flashlights, huddling together in silence. Then, fast footsteps rushed toward the tent. The fabric trembled as if someone was grabbing and shaking it violently. We screamed. I unzipped the tent in a frenzy, and one by one, we bolted into the woods, sprinting back toward the house. By the time we reached the clearing, our family was already outside, alerted by our terrified cries. I immediately accused my dad and uncle of sending someone to scare us, but they swore up and down that they hadn't. Then, I noticed something chilling. My sister and female cousins were already asleep inside the house. Our dads grabbed their rifles and went searching in the woods, but they found nothing. That was the last time we ever camped outside there. I was deep in Washington State, backpacking through the national parks. By the second day, I had already trekked about 20 miles from the nearest road and hadn't come across another soul. The air was crisp with the early signs of fall, but I had all the gear I needed to stay comfortable. That morning, I brewed a quick cup of coffee over my pocket stove before setting out for my next campsite, which was about 6 miles ahead. The trail was rugged, winding through the mountainous terrain, and about 4 hours into my hike, I heard something unusual: footsteps ahead. Looking up, I saw a man heading toward me, moving in the opposite direction. It was unexpected, but I nodded in acknowledgement as he passed. That's when I noticed something strange. He wasn't carrying anything. No backpack, no water, nothing. Just a long-sleeved shirt and worn-out hiking pants. My curiosity got the better of me, and I turned for another glance, only to find him doing the same. To avoid making things awkward, I quickly looked away and continued on my path, eventually pushing the encounter to the back of my mind. Several grueling hours later, I arrived at my campsite. It was more secluded than I had expected, with trees obscuring most of the view. Despite the disappointing location, exhaustion won out. I set up my tent and settled in to watch the sunset. Then I heard it, a rustling sound behind me. Turning around, my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The same man from earlier. He still had no gear, no supplies, nothing. But now, he was here. The problem? He had been walking in the opposite direction when we first crossed paths. For him to arrive at my campsite, he must have turned around almost immediately after passing me. Without a word or a glance in my direction, he walked to the far edge of the campsite and sat down on the ground. No tent. No sleeping bag. Just sitting there, staring into the darkening forest. A deep unease settled over me. This wasn't normal. Who was this guy? Why was he so far into the wilderness with nothing? My instincts screamed at me to leave, so I started packing my tent. That's when he turned his head. His eyes locked onto me, unblinking. He never looked away. As I stuffed my gear into my pack, he rose to his feet. I bolted. I could hear his footsteps behind me, keeping pace, growing closer. My fingers tightened around the small knife in my pocket. After a minute, I risked a glance back. He was still following but falling behind. Then I made a desperate move. I veered off the trail, diving into the dense forest. The darkness was thick, but I crouched behind a tree, holding my breath. Seconds later, his footsteps reached where I had left the trail. Then they stopped. Silence. And then he spoke, his voice eerily friendly, calling out as if we were old friends. The tone made my skin crawl. He called my name, though I had never told him what it was. Then, without warning, he stopped speaking and walked straight into the woods, disappearing into the blackness. I stayed hidden for over an hour before forcing myself to move. I hiked through the night, skipping my next campsite, only stopping when I reached civilization. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they never followed up. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. All I know is that I'm lucky I never had to find out. A couple of years ago, I decided to try camping for the first time. I had zero experience, but I figured the only way to learn was to jump in. I picked a campsite, a couple of hours from my city, secluded enough to feel like an adventure, but still populated enough that I wouldn't be completely alone. I arrived around noon, hiked for a few hours, and eventually reached the campground. It had a communal area with benches and grills, with smaller trails leading to more private campsites. I chose one, set up my tent, and by the time I finished, a few people had gathered in the main area, chatting and cooking. Not being the most social guy, I kept to myself until one of them, a guy named TJ, came over and invited me to join them. He was around my age, mid to late 20s, and seemed friendly, so I went along. The group was welcoming, and I hung around for a bit before heading back to my tent as the sun started to set. About an hour later, TJ showed up at my tent. He asked if I had ever been to this campsite before. I said no. Then, he asked if I knew about a hidden lake nearby. Again, I said no. His face lit up. "Dude, you have to see it. No one knows about it. It's amazing." I was intrigued, and he seemed genuine. So, without much thought, I grabbed my things and followed him. He led me down a narrow, barely used path through the trees, claiming it was only a 10-minute walk. 10 minutes passed. No lake. TJ, who had been chatty before, suddenly became quiet, responding to my questions with one-word answers. More unsettling, he kept glancing at the sky, watching as the last slivers of sunlight faded through the trees. Something in me shifted. A warning bell in my head told me to stop walking. After another few minutes, I subtly slowed my pace, creating some distance between us. Then, without warning, I turned and ran. "Hey!" TJ called, his voice still light-hearted at first, then it turned sharp. Angry. I heard him running after me. Adrenaline surged through my body. I weaved through the trees, heart pounding, trying to remember the way back. Then I heard it, a metallic clang behind me. Glancing back, I saw a knife bounce off a tree just feet from where I had been. TJ had thrown it. I ran harder, and eventually, I burst into the campsite, gasping for breath. When I told the others what happened, one of them called the police. But TJ, if that was even his real name, was already gone. And after searching, no one could find his tent. He had never planned to stay. He had been waiting, watching, choosing a target. That target had been me. Last year, I spent a few weeks in Montana, living out of the camper in the back of my truck. Most nights, I stayed at campgrounds or public land. On my last night, I was behind schedule, so I found a remote spot off the highway to park. The area was empty. I settled in for the night, but just as I lay down, headlights beamed through my window. A rusted truck pulled up, stopping at the entrance to my campsite. Instead of turning around or leaving, it just sat there. Something felt wrong. Minutes passed. Then, a door opened. 2 men stepped out, silhouetted against the headlights. They walked toward my camper, one of them holding something heavy. A crowbar. "Hey, buddy," one of them called, voice slurred. "We need some directions. Mind opening up?" I didn't move. Then, the other one scraped the metal against my door, pressing into it. Testing it. My heart pounded. Then a gunshot echoed through the woods. Not from them. From somewhere out in the darkness. The men froze. Without hesitation, they bolted back to their truck and sped off. I never saw who fired that shot. But I do know that, without it, I might not be here to tell this story. It was the winter of 2015, and I was working at a doctor's office in Branson, Missouri. I had just gotten a new iPhone and was eager to test out its time-lapse camera feature. On my way home from work one evening, I decided to stop and capture the sunset over Table Rock Lake. The evening was stunning, with the winter sun about to dip below the horizon. I parked my SUV at a state park entrance. The parking lot was empty, which didn't bother me at the time. I hopped out of the car and immediately felt the biting cold. Despite the sunshine, the air was frigid. I grabbed some gloves and a better pair of shoes from the back of my vehicle and headed down a trail leading to the lake's edge. I noticed the Branson Belle showboat slowly making its way across the water for its sunset cruise, and I thought it would be a great addition to my time-lapse. I was a 31-year-old woman, used to doing risky things on my own without consequence. The trail was marked by large rocks on either side, and I hurried down to the shore to set up my shot. In my haste, I lost my footing and fell hard. My head narrowly missed a sharp rock that could have knocked me out. My knee and hand stung from the impact, and it hit me how reckless I had been. No one knew where I was, and I had nearly injured myself on a deserted trail in freezing temperatures, with darkness minutes away. As I sat there recovering, I decided to film the sunset from where I had fallen. But what happened next made my fall seem like the least of my worries. "Can I borrow a light?" a voice suddenly asked. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Turning around, I saw a man standing about 20 feet behind me. I told him I didn't have a lighter because I didn't smoke. He then said, "I saw you getting out of your car up there. You have a real nice ass, you know." My heart sank. Where had he come from? There hadn't been a soul in sight when I parked. What he said next was even more chilling. Within less than a minute of appearing, he asked, "Hey, do you want to?" I knew I was in serious trouble. No one would hear me if I screamed. The Branson Belle was too far away, and the sound of the ship would drown out any cries for help. I quickly told him it was too cold to do anything outside and suggested we go to my car instead. I pretended to be interested, but my only goal was to get off the trail before the sun set. As we walked back to the parking lot, he asked if he could touch my butt. I agreed, knowing it was a test. I wasn't sure if he would let me make it off the trail alive, so I played along, hoping to appease him. He kept his hand down the back of my pants the entire walk. When we reached the parking lot, my heart sank again. My car was still the only one there, except for a vehicle that hadn't been there earlier. I realized it must have been his car. He had been hiding, watching me, and then followed me down the trail. I didn't call 911 on the trail because he was watching my every move. I needed to get out of there alive. I used the freezing temperatures as an excuse to refuse his advances, promising we could go somewhere warmer. But the parking lot was isolated, and no passing cars would see us. He began saying graphic things about what he wanted to do to me. I tried to get his name and number, but he refused. Why would someone refuse to give their name? He started unzipping his pants and tried to get me to do things to him. I insisted we go to my SUV first. As we walked, he grabbed something from his car. I'm pretty sure it was a gun. When we reached my car, I quickly unlocked only the driver's side door. I jumped in, threw the car into reverse, and sped off as he tried to open the passenger door. I didn't look back. I called 911 and gave them his description: a handsome man, about 6 feet tall, with blonde hair, brown eyes, and a muscular build. He drove an older, pale blue car from the early 90s. I never heard back from the police about my report. I may never know what he intended to do, but I felt the presence of absolute evil that evening. This story begins during a movie night at my childhood friend's apartment. We hadn't seen each other in a while and were catching up. Her place was cozy, a bit messy, but full of personality. We were in our comfy sweatpants, ready to watch some princess movies. We decided to order pizza for dinner, and my friend mentioned that Sherwood, someone I hadn't met, would be delivering it. At first, I wasn't thrilled. I thought she had invited other friends over, which wasn't what I had in mind. But Sherwood turned out to be just the delivery guy. When he arrived, there was an awkward air about him. He was nervous, fumbling with the pizza boxes, and avoided eye contact. My friend introduced us, and it was clear she was overly thankful to him. After handing us the pizza, there was some forced small talk before he left. Later, my friend explained that Sherwood was her unpaid personal assistant. He did her grocery shopping, delivered pizza, and ran errands for her. She thought he was just a lonely guy desperate for interaction, especially with women. Sherwood started a group chat with me and my friend, sending memes every week. It felt like he was trying to stay in our lives without being intrusive. He also offered to help with my errands. At first, I declined, but one day I made the mistake of accepting his help. I had found a great deal on a washing machine on Craigslist but didn't know how to pick it up or install it. Sherwood volunteered to handle everything, and he did it perfectly. I tried to pay him, but he refused, suggesting instead that I join him for a hike as a form of repayment. I agreed to the hike, rationalizing it as a fair trade for his help. The trail he chose was nearby and beautiful. As we walked, he chatted about ordinary things like work and hobbies. Everything seemed normal until he suggested we go off the main path to see something special. We reached a secluded spot, and there, to my horror, was a dead body. My heart raced as Sherwood stood there, eerily calm. The casualness in his demeanor made me feel even more uneasy. It was as if he was revealing a darker side of himself. The body smelled bad, but not like in the movies. I mumbled an excuse about needing to leave and started walking briskly back to the main path, urging him to follow. I felt like this was some twisted mind game, a way to intimidate me or make himself unforgettable. As we walked back, I was in full fight or flight mode, looking around for other hikers or park rangers. When I spotted someone, I called out for directions, making sure Sherwood and I wouldn't be left alone. I asked the man to walk us back to the parking lot, and he agreed. When we reached the parking area, I called my friend and told her I was with Sherwood. I suggested he drop me off at her place, making sure it was on record that he was the last person with me. I also texted her what had happened. When we got to her apartment, we thanked Sherwood and told him to leave. I then explained everything in detail to my friend, who was horrified. We both agreed we needed to remove Sherwood from our lives, but it had to be done gradually. I called the police that night, but it wasn't until a month later that I heard about an arrest related to a dead body found in the area where Sherwood had taken me hiking. The arrest wasn't Sherwood, but someone he followed on Instagram. I still don't know if Sherwood was connected to the murder. In August 2020, I moved to a small rural town in California to live with my aunt and uncle. The town was so small that you could drive across it in just 5 minutes. My best friend Haley and I, both in our late teens, often hung out at a local park. It was more of a small clearing with a few benches and a dirt trail near a river. One evening, we were smoking and relaxing in the clearing when we decided to explore the trail. We had been walking for about 5 minutes when I felt a strange tension in my shoulders, like someone was watching us. I looked back and saw a man on the trail behind us. Haley thought I was just being anxious, but something about him felt off. We kept walking, and I periodically looked back to keep an eye on him. He was a middle-aged man with dark hair, walking about 50 feet behind us. Suddenly, he started walking faster, almost speed walking. I turned around and started walking backward to show him I was aware of his presence. He veered off the trail, and I felt a bit silly for overreacting. But as I looked back one last time, I saw him sprinting toward us. I grabbed Haley's sleeve and pulled out a pocket knife. We started running down the trail, but the man was blocking our path back to the clearing. I called my uncle as we ran, telling him we were being followed. He told me to stay on the phone and be as loud as possible so he could find us. We reached the end of the trail, where an old metal fence surrounded some trees and what looked like an abandoned house. I pushed Haley to climb the fence, and I followed, tossing my knife and phone over first. We landed in a gated community, scaring a man walking his dog. He asked if we needed help, and Haley explained what had happened while I stayed on the phone with my uncle. My uncle arrived shortly after, shouting at the man on the trail that he had a firearm. The man with the dog led us to a gate so we could meet my uncle on the path. My uncle escorted us back to the car, his firearm ready in case the man reappeared. We never saw him again, and I haven't returned to that trail since. The experience left me constantly paranoid, always feeling like I was being followed. We never found out who the man was, but I'll never forget that terrifying chase.